Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. So my name is Stephen Evans. I'm the Chief Executive of the Learning and Work Institute, and I'm chairing this afternoon's webinar about job prospects and support for older workers. I have to say, as my age continues the gentle ascent towards that number, I increasingly dislike the term older workers, and I think as we go through the discussion, it'd be helpful perhaps to distinguish a little bit between groups of people over that age of 50, and I think there's a big difference between people who are the age of 50, but also for the big growth in people working above state pension age as well. So it'd be good to get through some of those details and those differences as we go through. A couple of bits of housekeeping first. So we are, if you're on Twitter, please do tweet away. The hashtag is older workers, having just said what I said about that title. So please do tweet away. And also the format for today. So I'm going to just say a few words by way of introduction to go through the reports that we published in partnership with the Centre for Ageing Better. And then going to pass across to Kim Chaplin, who's the Associate Director for Work at the Centre for Ageing Better, who's going to give some of her thoughts and reactions as well. And then we're going to go into a discussion about some of the issues that the report raises. So please do tweet away using the hashtag, and we'll try and pick up some of the things coming through that. Please do also use the chat box to ask questions or to raise issues or to give your thoughts on the issues or what you're hearing. I can't promise to sort of go through every single comment during the discussion, but we'll try and bring through as many as we can and try and make sure that we cover as many of the points that are raised through the chat box as possible. Last point before I begin the introduction is to say that we also are doing a poll via Slido to ask what you think some of the or the main focus or priorities for the policy response should be. So the ways you can get into that is you can use your smartphone camera to take a picture of the QR code there, and then that will take you through on your browser, or you can just go to slido.com and type in the event code, which is 5534. And that either of those routes should take you through to the poll question and the options which you can vote on. So that should hopefully all be active now. And you can see on the screen the options that you have to pick from. Those options clearly don't cover every single thing that could be done. So let's pick up some of the other ideas and thoughts through the chat box as well and have a discussion around some of those. But the four we've put on that poll are about ensuring, well, there you go, it's just disappeared. So you can see the four when you go to the Slido page anyway. So I shall leave you to do that at your leisure as we're speaking, and we'll close the poll off later in the discussion and see what the votes have said. So before I pass over to Kim, I'm just going to go through a few of the headlines from the reports that we published jointly with the Centre for Ageing Better and some of the findings that we found through that. So I guess there's been a heck of a lot of attention on young people throughout this crisis, particularly I guess in recent days with the exam results fiasco that's still ongoing. And support for young people is really, really important, and we need to do far, far better than we are. And that's a whole other subject, which you'll be delighted to know we have a webinar coming up on in the next few weeks, so you can sign up for that one as well. But I think support for those aged 50 and over risks getting a bit forgotten in all that focus on young people. And actually the effects to date of the pandemic have been quite profound. So a number of people aged 50 and over who are claiming unemployment related benefits has more than doubled in 4 months. And at some point or another, since the coronavirus job retention scheme opened, around about 2.5 million workers aged over 50 have been furloughed. So there's huge numbers there, either claiming unemployment related benefits or being furloughed. And we know that those who are over 50 and who lose their job are more likely to end up long-term unemployed. They're more likely to find it difficult to get back into the labour market than younger people. So, for example, people aged over 50 who are out of work are twice as likely to be out of work for a year or more compared to younger workers. And only 1 in 3 older workers returned to work after a redundancy in 2019. So we've had that big rise in unemployment, we've had that large number of over 50s furloughed, and we know that unemployment has really quite stark consequences when you're in that age group too. So there's a big challenge there. Now, as well as doing some of the data analysis, we also spoke to a number of people aged 50 and over, some of whom were furloughed, some of whom had lost their jobs in a range of different circumstances across the country. And what we heard were people worried about their finances and how they'd been impacted so far and how they'd be affected in the future. Stereotypes about people aged 50 and over, confidence and aspirations. Would employers give them a chance? How do I switch sectors or jobs or careers? How do I get those new skills to do that? So kind of range of challenges that people felt they were facing and that needed to be tackled. And if things weren't tough enough, we know that in different times before global pandemics were a thing here, that past employment support has not worked as well for this age group as for younger age groups. So if you take the work programme, for example, which was introduced after the last recession, people aged 50 and over were less likely to find and retain work through that than younger workers. And the same is true of lots of other employment programmes and initiatives as well. So we need to do better. We've got a big challenge. The consequences of not tackling it are quite stark, and we need to do better than we have done in the past. So the sort of things that we suggested in the report that should be looked at by the government were about, if we're going to have new back to work programmes, or we're going to look at how existing ones work or could be scaled up, we need to make sure that in the design and the delivery that they address the needs of all people, including those aged over 50, not just the youngest. So how do we do that? How do we make that happen in practice? What do we know works? What can we build on? Also, if you look at this pandemic in particular, it's had profound effects on retail and hospitality in particular, and some other sectors. If I could just ask those who are every now and again come off mute, if you could just mute yourselves just while we're kind of speaking, just so we can kind of keep the audio clear, that'd be great, please. Thank you. So this pandemic's had particular impacts on some sectors, and as social distancing continues, we're not going to get back to full capacity for retail and hospitality for at least a good few months. So where are the jobs going to come from? Well, in part, we need to help people to retrain, but how do we do that, and how do we help over 50s to do that? Adult training support has been really cut back since 2010, and what's left is more focused on younger people. So how do we help those aged 50 and over to retrain? How do we improve that support? And then lastly, I mentioned the financial circumstances before. How do we make sure that people have the right support, don't face big drops in their living standards, and are supported to retrain and find new work as well? So I think that's kind of my sort of shortish summary of the report and the findings as I saw them. What I'm going to do is pass over to Kim, and just before I do, just a reminder to keep voting on that Slido poll. and the event code is 5534. And Rasheen has kindly put the direct link into the group chat, and please do put your thoughts and comments and questions into the group chat as well, and we'll try and pick some of those up. But I'm going to pass across to Kim, who, as I said, is the Associate Director at Centre for Ageing Better, who we've been really pleased to work in partnership with on this report. So over to you, Kim.
Thank you. I am a voice from the deep and darkest internet because it won't let me start my video. Whilst that's sorted out, can I just say thank you everyone for joining us. But it might be quite useful to say a little bit about the Centre for Ageing Better. We are a What Works organisation. We are funded by a lottery endowment, and we aspire, our vision is to make what is going to be a longer life for all of us as high quality as it can be. So 100-year life is a real possibility, and it's becoming more so for more people. And our ambition is that we look at later life by intervening in what we call midlife, not older people, Stephen. So there's a lot of things you can do, and our target audience is people 50 to state pension age. And there's a lot you can do about your work. There's a lot you can do about your health. Hi there. And there's a lot you can do about your housing and your general what's going on in your life at that time that will actually make your later life a lot better. And we work in 4 key areas: health, employment, housing, and community connections. These are really important spaces. So that's just a little bit about us. We're delighted to work with the Learning and Work Institute on this report. It's been really timely and really insightful. Unfortunately, though, it doesn't contain good news. As the title says, you know, COVID-19 risks triggering long-term unemployment for 50 plus. And that's important, I think, when we look at this to understand where we're coming from. So if I could just go to the next slide, really. It's before COVID, where we were was really in a very tight labour market, with more 50 plus people working in that labour market than ever before. Many of the new workers to the labour market were women. And the drivers for that change really were that we are, like many Western populations, an ageing population. In fact, there are not enough young people flowing into the labour market to maintain the labour market as it was. So our labour market is naturally getting older. At that time, our labour market was tight. We had high employment, and we had looming Brexit, which meant that immigration and people coming from other countries, freedom of movement was drying up. And so we had a very compelling case for older workers in the labour market when we spoke to employers. These were the people that were going to fill the skill shortages. And a lot of this was driven also by equalisation and extension of pension age. So we were establishing, we were on a really good journey, we were establishing an expectation that people would work longer to support greater life expectancy, and that work is actually good for you, which is a change really. Work is one of the contributing factors to your health, to your social connections, and as Stephen said, to your financial support. So that was starting to become a thing, for want of a better expression. And we were starting to see, particularly in the middle income group, people that wanted to work for longer, that wanted to develop the jobs that we're doing into maybe some more flexible arrangements so they could move gradually into retirement rather than jumping off a cliff edge. We were also seeing, it has to be said, women who were expecting pensions, staying in the labour market because they needed to. So there was some push from both ends. But by and large, we were expecting by 2022 1 million more older workers to be in the labour market. And that's a good thing. And that has an economic underpinning. Austerity or welfare reform, whatever you want to call it, was driving really individuals taking more responsibility for their financial security. So the whole underpinning system was that, it's the same with universal credit, that you have a responsibility to find work. And so we were reducing the burden on the benefit system. But what's also really interesting is, prior to COVID, what we were looking at was a really substantial contribution of older workers to GDP. So we were estimating that if there was 1 million older workers that were involuntarily unemployed, found their place in the labour market by 2022. And that was going to be worth an extra 1.3% to GDP by 2040. So in effect, everything we were doing prior to COVID was about establishing a longer, later working life, albeit not in the design of people in their midlife, 35, 45, maybe shorter jobs. But that was definitely the direction that we were traveling in. And so the support systems around that were changing. And if we go to the next slide, let's have a look at what COVID does to us. Stephen's covered quite a lot of that, really. I mean, we're moving now from a threat to the individuals, but also a threat to economic growth of those individuals being in the workforce. The report, I think, is really useful because we're definitely moving from a place of being very positive about older people into the workplace into landing somewhere different. And I think what the report does is helps us to understand where we are now on that journey. Clearly, it's still going to unravel a little bit more, to estimate why we think we might land in terms of older people in the labour market, and to start thinking about what we can do to cushion that landing. What should we do that is different to what we've done in the past? So I'm not, this slide, I wasn't quite, we didn't cross bridges, Stephen and I, so Stephen's covered these numbers and I'm not going to cover them again. What I do want to say, though, is that actually what COVID has done is make us, I think, desensitize us a little bit to numbers. These are huge, huge numbers of people. And it's quite overwhelming. I think the other thing is that the labour market itself is quite concerning in terms of, depending on who you speak to. At the moment, there are 7 people for every vacancy, but sometimes it's 9 people for every vacancy. The labour market itself is very flat, and these numbers are very, very big. So when we talk about support for people and moving them back into the labour market, we do need to see some point of recovery. We do need to see more vacancies in that labour market as well. So timing will be a crucial thing. And one of the things that I worry about is there are going to be a lot of individuals that are moving out of furlough in October, and you do wonder whether the labour market will be ready for these people who have already been disengaged from the labour market probably for 6 months by then, and that's quite a worry. So we know that older workers are more likely to slip into long-term unemployment already. Most people on this call, I was very kindly shared a list of the people that had registered, will know that that's not new information, to be honest. All of us that have been around employment support for any length of time know that the 50+ group is a challenging group to work with. And almost, I think, again, it's that desensitization thing. It's actually something that we've come to expect from employment programs, and we need to move that dial. We really do. I started work after the 1980s recession, when we thought we were doing older workers, older unemployed people, a real favour by moving them onto order books, which in effect was retiring people early. We're going to have to think differently about retirement and later life as a whole, not just the individuals that are in this age group, but everyone that comes into contact with this group. We know this labour market is going to take a long time to recover. If we look at the Resolution Foundation's figures, they're estimating that actually it'll take us 7 years to get back to how the labour market looked prior to COVID. As somebody who's in her 6th decade, that is quite an alarming thought. And I want to come back to the people in that age group a little bit later on. But it's something that we need to really think about is that labour market is going to slowly strengthen. So where do older workers feel in this space? Older workers themselves are not feeling very positive. This report consulted a lot of people that were halfway through the process that have either been made redundant or have been furloughed. We also, just prior to this report, took forward a wide-ranging study with Mori. And Mori were, we found that half the people in their 50s and 60s expect their finances to worsen in the year ahead. And 7 in 10 of those who are currently workless don't feel confident they're ever going to get another job. So what we've got is a labour market that's quite stodgy, that's going to take some time to recover, and a group of individuals themselves that are starting to think about whether they're entitled to be part of that labour market, or whether actually that they've had their time. I'm getting a message that my internet isn't stable, so bear with me, please. Just on that piece then, in terms of the next slide, that's where we're heading. That's the journey that we're on. We are on a journey and we're going to have to monitor that journey. I'd like to just highlight a few areas that I think it's worth us discussing. Can I have my next slide, please? The first one is voice. I think it's really important, and the report says it, that we think again about the messages that we give to employers, to job coaches, to employment support services, and to older workers themselves, and how we talk about that group. I wouldn't underestimate that whole messaging, if you like, and the voice, because I think the influence that people shining a light on this challenge and making a case for older workers in the labour market will make a massive difference, I think. And to that end, the Centre for Ageing Better is really interested in convening a group just to provide that sort of focus. And we've had a really positive response to that. But I think it is really important that we take a look at how we approach this group, what our aspirations are for this group, and how we help the people themselves. We've got to do this together, really, not two people, but we all know that stuff, don't we? I think I would like to talk specifically about 60 plus. The report mentions this group. This is a new phenomenon for us, really, isn't it? 60 plus now is quite a big old chunk of people that will not be entitled to a state pension age till at least 66. And as we recover that, it's likely to move out to the right as well. We haven't really thought about 60 plus before. The thing that I would think is, have 60 plus people got enough time to wait for the labour market to recover, or do we need a more positive intervention for this? Do we need to think about this group differently? Is this a group that there's some sort of job creation that is needed for in a similar way to Kickstart? I don't know, but I think it's something we need to think about. And then two other areas I think are worth talking about are early intervention. Are we really able to take early intervention with this group? Or have this group already, are they already well on their way to long-term unemployment because of the amount of time they've been furloughed and not attached to real work? What does this group look like? And then just the financial well-being, I think, is something that we need to factor into this whole piece. We really don't want this group to be moving into retirement because they feel that is the only option for them and tapping into savings before they need to. That is a massive risk, both to the individuals and to our economy as a whole. And I think financial support and that whole conversation around finance is really, really important with this group. It may well be, though, that actually we also need to talk about, well, what does work look like for this group as well? Many of whom will be carers, and many of whom will have health issues that might mean that when they come back to work, they want to work in a more flexible way. Just on retraining, I mean, Stephen touched on this on adult learning. I think the thing about retraining later in your career, I talk from a personal point of view, is nobody in their 60s wants to undertake a 3-year degree and then a master's after that. You want meaningful training that is relevant, and you want it delivered in a way that isn't patronising, to put it bluntly. And sitting an older job seeker next to in a classroom of younger people who have never worked isn't always a recipe for success. Although it may well be the most effective and cost-effective way to deliver the training, it doesn't get you the results. So I think we do need to think about that whole retraining thing in a different way. And I think that is really hard when resources are tight. So I'm going to leave you with those 4 areas that I think are worth talking about, really. Voice, the 60 plus group, what is an early intervention with this group, retraining, and perhaps we'll touch on financial well-being as well. And that is me done. Thank you for listening to me.
Great, thank you, Kim. And I think as well as reflecting on where we are in this current crisis, I think it was very helpful to think about some of the pre-existing trends that we had before this crisis from the dim and distant land of 4 months ago, which kind of feels like a different world. But that idea about an ageing population, longer working lives, and all of those other societal changes. And I remember, well, in fact, let's pick up. So you kind of mentioned 3 points there. There's a load more we could talk about as well. And I guess there's a sort of the group of people aged 50 plus who have already lost their jobs, and then there's that sort of 2.5 million who have at some point been furloughed, and it feels unlikely that all of them are going to come back to their jobs as the furlough scheme ends. And you mentioned the sort of retraining point and where the job's going to come from and how do we link people over to them. And as Deborah has raised in the group chat as well about whether some of the sector-based sector skills academies or other employability courses or things like that are at too low a level, and do they match the needs and experiences actually of people aged 50 plus, that sort of midlife group that we've been talking about. And I think it probably links to a point that Tom Schiller's made as well about how we recognise skills and competencies, because there's more to life than qualifications. So I guess I'm kind of interested in your reflections on how those points link together and how we support people aged 50 plus, whichever group they're in, to do that retraining, recognising their skills and competencies, but also that if you're in that 60 plus group, which we should talk a bit more about, like you say, the sort of 3-year degree plus a master's probably isn't the sort of path you're necessarily wanting. I don't think I'd want to do that right now, to be honest with you. So kind of reflections on all of that together would be really interesting.
I'm really interested in work coaches. I think that it would be, because I think a lot of this is in the diagnostic. I think actually we need to spend a little bit more time triaging people and talking to them about what their aspirations are and helping them find a way through. And I think now is the time, if it wasn't before, to start to build capability in work coaches, to have specialist work coaches for this group. I think that if you just take CVs, for example, I've just moved out of an area that focused on young people, and the whole thing that you worked on was getting a footprint on the CV. These guys actually, people like myself, need to work through loads of data and look differently at their CV, assess their career, assess their strengths and weaknesses. And I think there's a real argument for pulling together a cadre of really well qualified work coaches that focus on older job seekers. And I think that will build, not only will that help the individual, that will build some intelligence about this group. I think the other thing that strikes me about 50 plus is the absence of information and data about this group. And I don't think you can plan for provision until you understand what your caseload, for want of a better word, looks like, and the quality of that either. So yeah, I think that's a real key, is to explore specialist work coaches and caseload in this group.
Well,
and how programs are designed, they tend to be generic.
Yes, indeed. And I remember having the debates about young people and disabled people as well, and sort of generic versus tailored, and you need to reflect the individual in everything that we do. Having sort of suggested that people don't want to go and do 3-year degrees and then masters, I should point out that Alison Walters has said that older people can get direct access to a master's based on their professional experience, and she's just done that. So congratulations to her, and please disregard my earlier comments. But I think that those kind of different route ways in, whatever works best for you, is the important point. And I guess I wanted to link back to the point about those furloughed workers as well. So 2.5 million in total aged 50 have been furloughed at some point. So there'll be less than that now because some people have gone back and some people will have lost their jobs, but still a lot of people. I slightly worry that we're sort of in the eye of the storm a bit, and that we've done surprisingly little at policy level for those furloughed workers to get them into some form. I think you said earlier actually that there'll be some people who will have not been at work even though they've been employed for 6 months by October, and then they risk losing their job. And it feels like there's very little happened from the Department for Education in England for that group. Getting them into learning or something to help them build up their experience, which will help them when they're coming back to work or trying to find a new job, I guess would be my pitch. What's your kind of thoughts around that furloughed group and what we should be doing now, given that we've got October coming up quite soon?
So first of all, I think we need to resist the call not to have conditionality. I think there's some really clear evidence that conditionality focuses advisors' minds, if nothing else. It's just the way that that's applied. So I think the worst case scenario is that we jump from no condition. I think we should have had more support if we could have had. So really, I mean, there were just not enough work coaches, are they? So the unfortunate thing is the size and scale and speed has meant that these people had to just revert to just the old benefit system and have their benefit worked. The risk for me now would be that suddenly we jump back into conditionality and people feel very punished. And what happens is we drive a lot of people away from UC because they've got just enough funds to get by, and they just see that whole system as punitive rather than helpful. And so I think we need to be very cautious. But as I say, I really, really don't want to see us calling for this group to be excluded from conditionality, because I think it would be the wrong thing. I also think actually that we need to think about outreach. I think there will be some people that need support, but have not decided to claim UC for all sorts of different reasons, and access to that support only comes with eligibility to that benefit. And we need to think about that, because I don't know whether that's right. And the pilot that we're doing with GMC actually is reaching out to a wider group of people than that UC group. I think that driver in Job Centre Plus is still very strong to get people off flows rather than outcomes. And I think we need to think about that a little bit more. But then if you think about the individuals themselves, there's almost a restart piece that is needed. I know that's an old program, but actually it's probably quite apt. I think that we need to treat every individual as just that, an individual, and there almost needs to be that restart process that would be that fresh claims process, which really does depend on work coaches. And personally, if I was running a job centre, which is where a lot of these people would be, I would have a team. I would separate out all my 50 plus and have a team just focusing on those guys and just having initial conversations with them that were quite open, if I was allowed to do that. I think what is interesting is where work coaches are going to be working, because there isn't the space in Job Centre Plus to have. I mean, it looks like all the funding, a lot of the funding is going to go into Job Centre Plus. So they're going to have a lot of staff and nowhere to put them. I'm a great fan of single points of access in local authorities. And I think the better partnership working we can see with embedded work coaches in local authority services, talking to elder workers in that sort of environment, the better. I think it's hard. I actually think it's very, very hard to think about a national solution. I think it has to be a local solution. It has to be embedded in other services, and it has to be relevant to that local labour market. There's no point in people having a really great time and having a really good employment programme, and the labour market isn't there to respond to whatever experience they've gone through. I think that's going to be the real trick, is that what people are engaged in is meaningful, and it is ultimately going to get people an outcome that's right for them. And that is going to be so tricky in this labour market.
Well, and lots of support coming through in the comments for the points around work coaches and skilled advisors. So I think that's kind of hit a chord there. And I guess I kind of wanted to pick up your sort of restart points. And at some point, all these programme names do come back round, so it probably will be soon. But so there's a kind of, so Jason Bergen in the comments was mentioning, should we have midlife career reviews linked to coaching, which gives me a great opportunity to plug a previous Learning and Work Institute programme where we did trial those midlife career reviews, which were delivered by Union Learn and Career Service and employers themselves and a whole bunch of others and housing associations. And I guess the sort of thing that struck me was how many people, this was aimed at people around about the age of 50, how many people were just pleased that someone wanted to talk to them about their sort of future, whether it's their career or how it links to their financial plans or retirement plans, whatever it happens to be. And careers advice was something that if it ever happened, it happened at school, and that was the end of it. So there was this huge demand, it felt, for it, and it kind of was partly about sort of mindsets as well as anything. And there was a sort of another comment in the chat as well about from Andrea, I think, about sort of social messages and societal messages about you know, sort of old versus young and that sort of thing. There was an article in the Times a few weeks ago which suggested that older people should retire so that younger people could get their jobs. So as well as being a complete misunderstanding of how the economy actually works, I just thought it was a terrible thing to say and to write, and a misunderstanding about just people's lives and worth and all the rest of it. So I guess there's kind of those points about at a societal level, the messages that we send, but then also at an individual level, how we get that spark. And like you say, most money is going through Job Centre Plus, but how do we get that other network out there as well, engage with people?
Yeah, I mean, I'm old enough to remember the job release programme, which was exactly that. Employers were paid to release somebody to go as long as they could demonstrate that they took a young person on instead. And that didn't make any difference at all to employment at all. It's been evaluated a few times, hasn't it? Yeah. There's a lot in that. Just remind me of that question again. I was thinking about job release and I lost the end of it.
It was more of a speech than a question, I fear. I guess there were 2 points. One is about the message that we send as a society about people aged 50 plus in the labour market and sort of old versus young. And then the second was how on an individual level we can engage and have that restart conversation, as you were suggesting, with people.
So I mean, I like midlife reviews. We're doing something with the NHS with employed people in midlife reviews, and it has struck me that actually that would be a really good vehicle to do a restart programme around, with some sort of schedule of assessment of where I am. I'm not a great fan of the career service. Sorry, anybody on the call. I think it would be interesting to put a wrap around a sort of career service for older workers, and indeed very encouraging if you had a service that was for restarting midlife, restart into the labour market. I think that, it could be the same service but just wrapped around slightly differently and more looking at, if you remember the job transition service, there's another one. People who are going to have to make a shift in their careers and what that might look like. For me, there's nothing more depressing than those case studies of people that have gone back to university and have got a degree in fine art and think it's going to improve their employment prospects. Those people have spent a lot of time and money, you see it with kids as well, actually, on doing something that has probably enriched their lives, but isn't going to make much difference to their employment prospects. So I think making the right decisions at key points is really important, and having help with that decision making is really important. So we're not going to get a lot more money, I don't think. I think the key in all of this is that is making the resources that are allocated work as best we can. And that's about collaboration and partnerships, really. And it's about Job Centre Plus being open, being really good at working in it locally. And to be honest, as an ex-Job Centre Plus person myself, they can be a bit hit and miss. I've seen some really fantastic local working, and I've seen some really terrible local working. So I think we need to keep knocking on the door with Job Centre Plus and trying to forge partnerships. And I think that's hard because they've got a lot to do. So we're just going to have to keep working hard at that whole piece, I think. And I think in terms of voice, I was really, really, really pleased to see how much coverage this report got last week. We couldn't have been better in terms of our timing, putting this out with the ONS stats. And my own ambition, my personal objective really, is to try and keep this there. I don't want to get in competition with young people. I think young people are really, really important. And I think the worst case scenario could be that we start presenting with people with a choice of young or old. But neither do I want to see older workers lost. And I think that's what has happened. I want to shine a light on this group because they're more important than they ever were to the workforce. And I'm one of them. And that personal ownership is really important. And I do think actually a lot of people on this call fall into that group and can self-identify, or will know somebody that is going through a terrible time at the moment. And that's the other thing. A lot of people will be touching the welfare system that never thought in their lives they were going to touch the welfare system. And that might bring about some change, actually. So I just think we need to keep shining a light. I think we need to monitor what's going on. We need to keep lifting it up. We need to get underneath the age thing, because I can't at the minute see anything other than gender underage. And I would like to understand the BAMI. I would like to understand the ability piece. The data is quite poor, actually. And even if we shine a light, people are going to start counting things and we'll be able to see more. And I think now is quite an interesting time for evidence, actually. So we'll see. We'll see.
Well, as an organisation that does lots of research, we're in favour of more research and more data. So I heartily endorse that call. I want to kind of come on to the over 60s in a moment, but before we do, there's lots going on in the chat here about, which is kind of some examples about good practice, but also about how we deliver things and how we join things up. And I think so Mark Cousins was suggesting we should scrap the National Career Service and better integrate IAG into, other services that we already have. And then there's, I know, so the National Career Service over time has ended up more and more focused on young people and more focused on those out of work. And I'm not sure in that context what its role is vis-a-vis Job Centre Plus, really, because it kind of isn't Job Centre Plus trying to get people out of work into work. And there's lots of, I mean, you and I both remember from previous jobs as well as current jobs, the sort of the list of acronyms that are involved in any service relating to employment and skills and learning, and the sort of challenge of joining all of that up. And also the constant chop and change. Whenever I do presentations, I usually show a diagram of the system and say, the good news is that if you don't like any of these policies or organisations, they won't be here in 3 years' time. And that's also the bad news, because we just chop and change all the time. So I guess you talked about localisation earlier and delivering things locally. What's your kind of, is there a role for combined and local authorities to try and join these services up for people locally, or how do we make that sort of stuff?
I'm really hoping to see more devolution, because I think I'm a big fan of decision making being as close to the point of service delivery as it can be. Way back in not that distant past, actually, I worked in East London with the Olympic House boroughs, and the games itself was really galvanising and helped people work together better than they had in the past. But then that focus was, there were some really excellent services that presented really great value for money. So I think that's important, but it still needs to be well funded. I think the other thing is, one of the frustrations I have around local authorities is that they don't always match travel to work patterns, particularly in London. And they've got this really odd service agreement that you're there for your residents, so therefore you only support your residents, but actually they're not likely to work in your borough. And so I think the sub-regional structure in London is really interesting. And I think that people should look to that and invest in that a little bit more. I would like to see partnerships evolving as opposed to, on the one hand, I'm arguing for grassroots and decision-making close to point of delivery, but I think the unit of delivery needs to be sensible, and it needs, when it comes to work, to map onto a labour market that's going to work for individuals rather than just be about the resident. And one of the things that I think is really strikes me when I look at local service deliveries, when I look at how money is spent, 90% of the budget is spent on support for the client, and 10%, if you're lucky, is spent on employee relationships, working with employers and working with the labour market. I think people need to look quite hard at that. And I don't think every team needs to have an employment service. I think it would be great if people could collaborate around employee relationships. And I know when it comes to programs and output payments, that causes tremendous problems. But I think people need to have a look at that. I think there ain't going to be that many jobs, and employers are not going to welcome 500 people knocking on their door. So I think people need to think quite hard about how they're going to manage the employment end of the services that they're delivering. And collaboration around that would be good.
A last reminder from me to, if you haven't already, please do go and vote in the Slido poll. The link has just been put up in the chat box there. We'll be closing that off in a few minutes, so please do go and vote on that. I want to pick up the sort of employer point, because when some of the discussions that we had with sort of people externally about this report, somebody did ask, well, employers being asked to do loads of stuff, it's kind of work placements, work experience for schools, T-level placements, sector-based work academies, kicks, blah, 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 blah. What do you actually want them to do? Do you think if they've got a vacancy, should they give a young person a fair chance on the career ladder, or should they be looking at that sort of older person? And actually, I guess the point is we kind of want them to do everything where it's appropriate, because we don't want to set off groups against each other. But how do we sort of do that sort of work with employers, given the range of things that we're asking them? How do we make sure we get this group there, but we don't do it at the expense of others?
So I would really like to be able to make the case, supported by evidence, for multi-generational teams being the most productive. And that's what AARP do in the States. So how they support their employment programs around elder workers is that they make the case to employers that a multi-generational team is more productive than any other sort of teams, on the basis that young people work faster but make more mistakes, elder people work slower and less mistakes. And when you put the two together, the older people work at the same rate, but their influence on the younger people is that they make less mistakes. And there's a study in Germany that validates this. Nobody in my evidence team will let me make that case because it's not robust enough. But I think around voice, I do think this is one of the things that we need to amplify, that actually it's about diversity, and multi-generational teams are what you need to be thinking about. And so when you're thinking about downsizing, don't automatically go to an early retirement program because it's easy, because nobody likes to make anybody redundant. Really think about your workforce and plan for your workforce, and make sure that you have a diverse team and that you have the team that you need to deliver the bottom line that you want. We're about to do a piece of work to just see where employers' heads are, because it's all right me saying that, Rational Kim sat here in the middle of the countryside. My experience of talking to employers at the moment is cash flow is killing them. They don't want to talk about anything but cash. Survival is the issue. And so we're going to have to think about when to have that conversation. And it may well be that you have some deep relationships with local employers that you can start that conversation now. But I do think that we will need to do something a bit bigger and broader with employers later down the line, along that sort of drift, really.
Okay, and let's I pick up the point about over 60s, which you mentioned at the start. And I remember when I worked in the Treasury, which was a long time ago now, we spotted that the biggest or the fastest employment growth was in that sort of age group. And we were trying to debate about whether this was because people were forced to because they didn't have enough money to retire, or whether actually they kind of wanted to, and it was about sort of the 50-year career and, work and phased retirements, or however you want to phrase it. And of course it's both of those things and a whole bunch of other things and all the rest of it. But I'm kind of interested, particularly through this pandemic and the effect it has on that group in terms of health and work. What's your kind of thoughts about some of the challenges there and what we should be doing?
So, I mean, I think it's really interesting the time we're in, because what we're seeing is women that have had full-time careers for the first time. The impact of maternity leave, we're only really seeing those women it coming to the end of, well, I don't like to talk about the end of career, because I think a lot of people didn't think that it was the end of career until COVID. And so when we talk about end of working life, we thought that decision's been made for people rather than, when did people think they were going to retire? So that's the first thing. My concern, though, is if you are unlucky and your job has ended, is there enough time? Is the labour market going to give you enough? It's a bit like the argument about young people and scoring. Is the labour market going to recover in time for you? Or do we need to think about this group a little bit more and prioritise them into some of the job creation, if you like? So, and is a push into regen the right sort of opportunities for this age group? I think not. I think that's going to be construction and those sorts of things, which can be great for youth. So should we be asking government to think about a sector that might be appropriate for this group and giving it a bit of a boost? I don't know. When Bill Wells tells you he's worried about 60-year-old women on Twitter, you think, I might have to give this a bit more thought. I think I'm not keen on, I do like intermediate labour markets, I have to say, and I do believe that there will in the end have to be some job creation, whether that's at a local level or nationally, to tide us over till the labour market recovers. And I think this group is probably one of the groups we need to focus on.
And I should say, for those who don't know, Bill Wells is a former senior civil servant at the Department for Work and Pensions, and he's always well worth listening to, and he's often right, but you can kind of judge for yourselves, and then you'll know exactly what Kim's talking about.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask one more question, then I'm going to try and get the poll results up. So a couple of people have asked, the most recently Mark Cousins, about self-employment and people starting their own businesses and enterprise, and to what extent that's a good option in this group, and do we have the right set of supports there, or is there more we can do? What's your kind of take on that?
I do believe that self-employment is something that we need to think about a bit more. I think actually that there will be more enterprise as a result of COVID, full stop, across the labour market. I think there'll probably be more 0 hours contracts than we've got now. So we need to think about the protections around that. I think a lot of older workers move into enterprise because they've got a pension, but it's not quite enough. So the way they take it forward is that supplementary thing. And I've seen some really interesting bits and bobs happening in rural economies. And I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of older workers find a place themselves in local economies through an enterprise endeavour. And so, yeah, I think that needs to be thought about. We know that DWP are going to carry on with the broad-based national programme in support for enterprise. But I think in terms of local authorities and local infrastructure, I've started to see consultations. I've just seen something from the West Yorkshire Combined Authority where they're consulting with employers about the labour market, and I think everybody's going to start doing that. And I think within the product that comes out of that, there needs to be a space for micro businesses, and because I think that will be one of the bridges, if you like, until the labour market recovers. And actually, from the point of view of local labour markets working and local economies working, they might be a really important part. You know, and again, that's down to local authorities, I think, perhaps thinking about services and infrastructures and how they're going to commission to fill gaps. I don't know. It's an interesting space, but there was already a lot of older workers moving from full-time employment into enterprise, sometimes just turning into consultants, but often running micro businesses that, you know, probably wouldn't be viable to somebody in their 30s and 40s for a full income, but for a part income, really good things.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think there's lots, as you say, there's lots sort of going on in different parts of the country. And actually some examples have cropped up in the chat as well. But one of the big challenges, I think, is how we share some of those experiences and examples and best practice around, which we definitely need to find a way to do more of. I'm going to ask the team if they can bring up the results of the poll for me, please. There we go. So we have a clear winner, which is about making sure that support programs meet the need of people over the age of 50. And then a sort of relatively even split below that about skills funding and access to traineeships and access to employment support programs. So I guess there's kind of a pretty clear winner there. So Kim, given that, because trying to make sure that employment support programs work better for this group is one of the things that we pulled out of the report, and I think we've talked about quite a lot of that as we've gone through about how we can do some of that. Do you have any other sort of thoughts or ideas about how we make sure that whatever comes next in terms of employment programs, because clearly there's going to be more and they're already scaling up existing programs, how do we make sure that they do better for this age group than previous programs like the work program?
Well, I think we can apply a bit of pressure. That's always a good thing. But I think actually what we need to do is, right from the top down, establish some sort of leadership group. So I think DWP needs to be seen, the Fuller Working Lives team, talking to their programming and commissioning team and to external providers of services, because what needs to knit together is what DWP puts in place in job centres and what happens in programmes. And you know, if they just picked off one or two big things, like, for example, building a cohort of specialist work coaches internally and externally, that would be a really good thing to do. And if we just look at performance frameworks and we start to, I don't like naming and shaming, but if we hold up, I would like to see us have a target, actually. And what I would like to see is everybody aspire to close the gap on performance of programs between 50 plus and the 35-45 group. Why can those people do so well? Why do we do so well for those people who some would call low-hanging fruit when we don't 50 plus? So if we could just have a little covenant that said, look, we're going to try and get this group somewhere near the middle group, that would be great. That would be really good.
And if we could just take, I think we've seen the poll results now, so I think we can take that slide down, please. Thank you. So all the team are very busy writing a research proposal for why multi-generational workplaces are the best for productivity. I think, yeah, I've been winging its way to you shortly.
Good.
I think one of the points you mentioned earlier was about people who've maybe got just enough, or can scrape together just enough cash to not go on universal credit, and they don't necessarily want to be. So in terms of employment programs, I remember talking before about lots of young people who are out of work aren't claiming benefits, and we shouldn't just ignore them. We should try and go and find them and do something to help them as well. It feels like it's the same but in a different context for this age group as well. Is that the sort of thing you're thinking about in terms of how we engage people through all those networks that you were talking about before to get them into the system, and even if, or get them access to employment programs even if they don't want to or need to claim universal credit, for example?
Yeah, I think that's something that we need to do. I also would like to see some better, what DWP and government done is quite a positive drive on careers and apprenticeships and everything else, advertisements on television. Whenever I see any news about older workers accessing welfare services, it's always people that are incredibly ill and are still being sanctioned. You know, I would like to start to see a few stories of people that have been helped into work and have had a really good service. A lot of people get shocked by job. I mean, the thing that I went into a job centre the other day in Bolton, really, really, really great job centre, but I haven't been in a job centre for about 5 years. There were no jobs. There were no jobs to see. And so I just would associate it as a benefit offer. And that for older workers is not the signal we want to give. And so I just think we need to just think that through, really, what we're saying to these people, how they feel. And so, yes, we need to outreach, but just outreaching and putting people into that service as it looks now, is people are not going to feel comfortable. There needs to be a change to where we're putting people, as well as when we've outreached, where we ask them to go to needs to change.
Yeah, I think there's a big debate to be had about public employment service versus benefit administration service, and we've kind of ended up slightly more at the latter, which is in fact just what Deborah has suggested on the chat there, actually, very fortuitously. So unfortunately, though, we're going to have to set up another webinar to discuss that one, because we are very unfortunately out of time. I could have talked for hours more, and I'm sure you'd all be very pleased to hear from Kim, and very delighted that I'm not allowed to talk for any longer. But Kim, we're really grateful both for working together with you and the Centre for Ageing Better on this report and lots of other things as well, but also for this discussion this afternoon, which I think from my point of view, and I'm sure from everybody here as well, has been really, really useful and interesting, and sparked off loads of thoughts, both about what we need to argue for, what we need to know a bit more about, but also what we can actually practically do and get on with as well, and make a difference with. So I'm very grateful, and all of us at the Learning and Work Institute are, for the Centre for Ageing Better's support and partnership working on this, and for your contribution today as well. So thank you for that, Kim.
Thank you.
A big thank you to everybody for dialing in to this webinar as well, and for contributing to what was a really lively group chat as well. I tried to get through as many of those points and questions as we could. Inevitably didn't quite get to any, but I hope we kind of covered lots of the topics, and there's lots more to discuss. And you can view all of this again, should you wish, on YouTube when we get the recording up there as well. So thank you very much, everybody. I hope you found that interesting and useful.